This is a brief summary of my paper, Optimal Search and Discovery. The main goal is to just give an overview, whereas all the modeling details and technical aspects are going to be discussed in the paper itself. So let's start with the motivation and some background. We have that in many settings or markets, consumers only have limited information on the available alternatives. So in order to compare the products, they first need to search for information on them. If this search is costly, then this is going to lead to search frictions where consumers do not compare all the alternatives and therefore may fail to buy the one that they actually prefer. These search frictions have been studied extensively in the literature, where the analysis is usually based on optimal search policies that describe how a rational consumer will search given his expectations and the cost of searching. Broadly speaking, so far we have optimal policies for two types of search problems. Either consumers are assumed to have no prior information, so they just search randomly across the alternatives and only decide when to stop searching, or they have partial information on all the alternatives based on which they also decide on the order in which they're going to search products. In my paper, I extend this literature by introducing limited awareness into a sequential search problem. What I intend to capture with this is that in many settings, it's easy to imagine that a consumer has partial information only on some alternatives. So he might have heard about some options from his friends, or he's seen some ads, but usually there's also a lot of products that the consumer has never heard of. So if a consumer is not aware of a product, meaning he has no information on it and does not even know whether it exists, he cannot just decide directly to get more detailed information on this product. So for a product the consumer initially is not aware of, he first needs to discover and become aware of it through some broader search, which also reveals just some initial information. So what this means is that with limited awareness, a consumer not only decides on the order in which to inspect products he's already aware of, but also when to continue on and try to discover more products through this broader search. This leads to what I call the search and discovery problem, and in the paper I formalized the underlying decision process as well as solve for the optimal policy. To show you how the decisions in the search and discovery problem really look like, let me just briefly walk you through a simple example. So let's think of a consumer looking to buy a mobile phone, and initially he's only aware of a single phone. So the decision he now faces is to either inspect this phone in detail or put in a broader search to try to discover more alternatives. If the consumer now goes on and discovers a second phone, the decision he now faces is whether to inspect either of these two phones he is now aware of, or continue and go on to discover even more phones. Once the consumer inspects a phone, so in this case the second phone, the decision now changes in that the consumer now has full information on this inspected alternative and he now can buy it. However, if the full information reveals, well, this phone is not really a good match for this consumer, he will go on and either decide to discover even more alternatives, or go to the first phone, which he then can also inspect. So as you can imagine, this can become a fairly complex dynamic decision process, in particular when there are many possible alternatives. But as I prove in the paper, the optimal policy is fully characterized by tractable reservation values. These values are essentially Gittins index values, but with the difference that whereas the Gittins index in general can be difficult to compute because it takes into account a lot of future periods, I show that in this case, these reservation values remain tractable and are based on a myopic comparison that is very similar to the one underlying the reservation prices that have been found that Weitzman used in his really well-known Pandora's problem. I generally think this is a nice result because it really simplifies dealing with this more general type of search problem. And I also think that it can enable future empirical applications that use a revealed preference approach based on observed search paths, for example, coming from clickstream data from some online retailers or other types of online data. The second main result that I show in the paper is that a predetermined index fully specifies purchase outcomes. This means that it is possible to specify which product a consumer will eventually buy without having to consider all these possible search sequences that can lead to different purchases. This result is essentially a generalization of the eventual purchase theorem of Choi, Dai, and Kim. And it's useful because it allows to directly derive aggregate demand for products within this type of search framework. It also leads to an analytical expression of a consumer's expected payoff, which is really helpful once we want to do comparative statics for consumer welfare. Now, I don't have much time to talk about this, but in the paper, I also compared the search and discovery problem with existing approaches, namely random and directed search. And here I just like to point out two things. First, both random and directed sequential search are nested within the search and discovery problem. And second, I also compare how these search problems generate ranking effects, which is essentially the observation that products discovered early during search are more likely to be bought. And this term comes essentially from the empirical literature from online markets, which finds that products or ads shown at the top of websites are more likely to be clicked on and bought. I also argue that in the search and discovery problem, these ranking effects provide a very clear model of how informative advertising can benefit sellers, because if we think of informative advertising as making consumers aware of a product, then in the search and discovery problem, using informative advertising increases demand through utilizing these ranking effects. So to conclude, limited awareness leads to a novel search problem. In the paper, I show that the optimal policy for this general search problem remains tractable, as well as provide results that help in aggregating purchase outcomes into demand functions. And finally, given the tractability, I just like to point out that I think the results also provide a good basis for future research. For example, I would find it, as I pointed out, it could be interesting to look into informative advertising that can make consumers aware of the product and study this in an equilibrium type of model. So thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions or feedbacks, I'd be very happy to hear from you. And finally, I just like to also thank the organizers for this opportunity to present a paper online, given that the conference and Applied IO School that I was really looking forward to attending unfortunately had to be canceled this year.